Hello, friends. I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the second edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for very positive feedback after the first edition. Thank you for your comments and questions. I will eventually have an entire edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor in which I will answer your questions based on the reports in the major Russian newspapers. Remember, what I'm providing here is an impartial and objective presentation of the Russian news that the Russians in Russia are reading. I go beyond the English language Russian media such as the RT and Sputnik, which have their own agendas in terms of what they want the outside world to know about the Russian positions. I read the actual Russian newspapers and give you the real story. And in this edition, I will focus on 6 front-page articles published during the last week. So, let us begin. We'll start today with Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the newspaper which is 100% owned by the Russian government. Let's start with the story from the edition for October 7, 2016. The title on the front page says, Angela Merkel is looking for allies for imposing new sanctions on Russia because of Syria. The continuation of this article is on page 8 and has the subheading in the form of question and answer. The question is, who is telling Merkel what to do? And the answer is the US. The US is using the German Chancellor in order to convince the European Union to impose new sanctions on Russia. And the photo that accompanies the heading is also very telling, because it is showing somebody's raised finger right in front of Merkel's face. The article begins by highlighting the report of Deutsche Welle, which is the German state-owned news agency, which says that the United States is preparing new sanctions against Russia. And there was the recent meeting of the German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier with the high-ranking officials from the United States, Great Britain, and France, and this issue was discussed at the meeting. Now, let me remind you that I wrote about Steinmeier as the main US agent of influence in the German government in a recent article for Newsbud. As I showed in this article, I found very strong evidence for this claim in the leaked confidential files of the Montenegrin government, more specifically in the confidential report of the Montenegrin embassy in Berlin. The embassy reported on the meeting between Steinmeier and Igor Lukšić, who at the time was the foreign minister of Montenegro. And in this meeting, according to the report, Steinmeier was aggressively anti-Russian. In other words, he used the main points of the United States propaganda against Russia.
Yet we know that Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation, to our freedom, to the peace of the world.
Now, to go back to the article in the Russian press, it is not clear whether these new sanctions supported by Steinmeier would be supported by the coalition partners, the Social Democrats. And here I would like to highlight the role of Gerhard Schröder, who was the Chancellor of Germany about 10 years ago, and who at this time is on the board of directors of the Russian Gazprom, which is the state-owned Russian gas company, and I'll talk about Gazprom a little bit later. The conclusion of the article is that Merkel's pro-American line is actually losing support in Germany, the line that advocates further sanctions against Russia. Most politicians in Germany actually expect the United States and Russia to eventually come to a compromise and make a deal on Syria. And the Germans support the continuation of negotiations between the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and the US Secretary of State John Kerry. It's also interesting that this article, published in the Russian government newspaper, discusses the views from several United States publications, including the National Interest. These publications argue against the US use of force in Syria. They claim that the US use of force in Syria would end up badly for the US vital national interests. At the very end, the article states once again that the lines of communication between Lavrov and Kerry remain open. In other words, the Russian government is telling the world that there is still time to end Syrian conflict without further bloodshed. Now let me move to the second article from the same newspaper, the Rossiyskaya Gazeta. This is the edition for October 10, 2016. And the title of the article is Iskander-M was tested on an American spy satellite and NATO got scared. The article continues on page 6. It has the photo of the Iskander-M rocket system and all of its component parts. And the article refers to what it calls the hysteria in the Western media, mass media, about the transfer of these tactical ballistic missile systems called Iskander-M. And let me remind you, in Arabic, Iskander means Alexander. Moving of these missile systems capable of carrying nuclear missiles into the Kaliningrad region via the Baltic Sea. The Kaliningrad region is a Russian territorial enclave that shares no land border with Russia, but borders Poland and Lithuania. Both are NATO member states and also the EU member states. The representative of the Russian Defense Ministry, General Igor Konashenko, who's become well known in the Western media, stated that this was nothing unusual, that it had been done before and will be done again. This is the part of the regular rotation for the weapons of this kind all across the territory of the Russian Federation. Konashenko also stated that they tested one of the Iskanders by directing it at the US spy satellite in order to check the US reaction. The Russians consider moving the Iskanders to the Kaliningrad region as a defensive measure and as an answer to the US building up the anti-missile shield in Eastern Europe. Let me remind you that one of the military bases for this missile shield that the US is building up and the projection of US and NATO power toward Russia has already been set up in Deveselu in Romania. There are even credible reports that the United States has moved the nuclear missiles from the Incirlik base in Turkey to this base in Romania. Interestingly, the article does not mention this. We can only speculate why that is so. Are the Russians perhaps hiding this information from their population, from their public? This reminds me of the New York Times publishing article after article on Syria in early September 2015 without ever mentioning that the Russians have a naval base there. The article also mentions that the US is building up another missile defense base in Poland, in the place called Rezikovo, and that this base is scheduled to be completed in 2018. This appears to be the newest addition to about 800 military bases that the United States already has around the world. In addition to this, the article reports that the US received the permission of the Spanish government to have the naval station Rota as the home port for 4 US Navy ships with the Aegis ballistic missile defense system on board. This includes the USS Donald Cook, which recently made news when it was buzzed by 2 Russian Sukhoi 24 planes near the Kaliningrad region. According to the Russian military sources, by 2020, the US will probably develop weapons capable of destroying the intercontinental ballistic missiles in flight. The Russians claim that they have no intention of waiting for this to happen without planning and instituting a set of countermeasures, one of which is practicing the mobility and movability of the Iskander systems. This article concludes that it is precisely the mobility of the Iskander that scares NATO the most, because once Iskander rockets are launched, there is no known technology to stop them. I'd like to talk about one more article from the Rossiyskaya Gazeta. This is the edition for October 13, 2016. On the front page, there is the photo of Vladimir Putin, and the article is about Putin's statements at the business forum in Moscow. During his speech, Putin tackled not only economic issues, but he also talked about geopolitical matters. He stated that Russia wants friendly relations with the United States, but what Russia is getting from the United States is not a willingness to have a dialogue, but a desire to give orders and push Russia around. This is not acceptable, says Putin, and there is no way that Russia is going to agree to this kind of treatment. Putin says that Russia will protect its national interests and that it has the means for doing so. He stated that he plans to work with whoever gets elected to be the next US president, but he adds, and this is a quote, if, of course, the other side is willing to work with us. Putin also says that Russia is being used as a boogeyman to scare the American voters to support a militaristic agenda. He dismisses the recent US accusations of war crimes and states that the humanitarian convoy in question was attacked not by Russia or Syrian government troops, but by a terrorist group. And he added, and this is a quote, Americans know this, but it is politically useful for them to blame Russia. Putin concludes in his speech that Russia is far from being politically and economically isolated, and that the sanctions hurt more the European Union and the world economy than they hurt Russia. Russia has a workable plan, according to Putin, to reshape its economy, and has already done a great deal on import substitution by producing its own food and other products previously imported from the European Union and also the United States. And to continue this theme of Russia not being economically isolated, let's move to the Kommersant, the newspaper which is a liberal business newspaper, which typically represents the interests of liberal business in Russia and big companies in Russia. So let's go to the edition for October 7th. The front page article that we have here is about very close cooperation between the Gazprom, which is the Russian state-owned giant gas company, and the Dutch-British Shell. There is the photo of an embrace between the head of Gazprom, Alexei Miller, and the head of Shell, Ben van Beurden. The negotiations between the two, between Miller and van Beurden, were about a joint liquid gas terminal in the Leningrad region for the export of gas outside Russia. And this is in spite of the EU and US economic sanctions. The giant Western energy conglomerates have their own geopolitical and profit-making agenda. The decisions of various governments seem to be no obstacle to them. And I guess in their globalist fashion, they consider national sovereignty as a thing of the past. This, in my opinion, goes a long way to point out who is really in charge in the so-called Western democracies. The giant corporations make their own rules. The sanctions are for the small fish and affect the ordinary people and small business that no government elite anywhere cares about. Now let's move on to the Nezavisimaya Gazeta, which is the middle-of-the-road Russian newspaper. Let's look at the edition for October 7, 2016, and let's continue with the examination of the economic themes. So on the front page, we have an article with the title, Russia and China Compete for Uzbekistan. And the title is, Beijing beat Moscow in investments in business projects in Tashkent. Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan. The article continues on page 7, and the heading is that Russia could strengthen its position in Uzbekistan. And the article talks about a special economic investment zone being set up in the region of Samarkand. The article discusses the tenuous political and economic stability in Uzbekistan after the recent death of its longtime authoritarian leader Islam Karimov. It chronicles the recent political decisions of the acting president Shavkat Mirziyoyev dealing with the liberalization of the economy. It is curious that Uzbekistan is beginning to apply the neoliberal economic model at a time when this model is being abandoned in Europe due to its horrific effects on the livelihood of ordinary people. To me, this looks like the beginning of a tremendous deception of the Uzbek people being pulled off by the new leadership. The only novelty is that instead of the Western corporations doing the ripoff, as the case was in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia now, the same role will be played by the Russian and Chinese companies. Just like elsewhere in Eurasia, the Chinese are primarily interested in investing in big infrastructure projects, such as the railroad networks and highways, while the Russians, just like the Americans, typically focus more on the industrial and military matters. I would like to note that this article makes no mention of ethnic or religious matters relevant to the current situation in Uzbekistan. It paints the situation in the country as peaceful in the long run, whereas many independent observers consider Uzbekistan becoming the center of Islamic extremism in the near future, most likely organized and financed by the usual suspects from the West. And I have one more article from the Nezavisimaya Gazeta, and this is the last article I'll talk about in this edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. There is the front page photo of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and the Russian and American flags in the background. So this is the edition for October 10th, 2016 of the Nezavisimaya Gazeta. The title is a bit enigmatic. The title says, Lavrov reminded the United States about the hangover. What hangover are the Russians talking about? Well, the subtitle gives more information. The head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs admitted that there is a total crisis in the relations between Moscow and Washington. And the source for this article is the interview that Lavrov gave to the state-run TV, in which he said that, quote, and this is quote, what is taking place is not only rhetorical Russophobia, but aggressive steps which really affect the Russian national interests. Among them, Lavrov says, the most significant are the expansion of NATO and the economic sanctions against Russia. According to Lavrov, this anti-Russian direction of the US foreign policy was established long before the Ukrainian crisis. He goes on to say that perhaps in this offensive US attitude toward Russia, there could be something personal. It could be that some US policymakers, what we typically can call the globalist faction within the US establishment, that they are not getting what they expected to get from Russia. In Lavrov's opinion, and he's speaking from experience, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, some influential political players in the United States thought that they could have Russia in their pocket, that they could dominate it and exploit its people and resources as much as they wanted. In essence, they wanted to be the masters of Russia's destiny. But according to Lavrov, they were rudely awakened when the Russians said "niet," no. So what is happening now is like a hangover, according to Lavrov, from the sweet but impossible dreams of the US global empire, the Pax Americana of the neocons. The Russians stood up for their independence and sovereignty and want to listen to nobody, says Lavrov. In terms of Syria, Lavrov says that the negotiations failed because the United States and its allies on the ground did nothing of what they agreed to do. For instance, as soon as the military of the Syrian government would withdraw in accordance with the ceasefire deal, the rebels would move in and take those positions. And all the while, the critique for the continuation of the war would be directed against Russia. But Lavrov says Russia will not stop and will continue to fight against the terrorists in Syria. In terms of the possible US military intervention in Syria and the attacks on Assad's military, for instance, Lavrov reveals that he talked to Kerry about this and about the dire consequences for the US if they decide to do so. And Lavrov says that neither Kerry nor Obama would support the US military intervention in Syria. He also repeats that the US attack on the Syrian army troops in Deir ez-Zor was not a mistake. He adds that it appears that the US does not have a consolidated strategy in Syria, that there is no general plan, and he implied that there are factions with different interests within the US government, that there is a pro-war party, the war party, within the US government. The article then covers the meeting of the United Nations Security Council, in which both the Russian and French resolutions on Syria failed to be approved. Russia vetoed the French resolution, which it called propagandistic and one-sided. The resolution called for the no-fly zone above Aleppo, which Russia thought would save the extremists from total defeat and allow them to get more supplies, more weapons, and more recruits. This was the 14th veto by Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. It should also be pointed out that since that time, the United States has also vetoed 14 UN Security Council resolutions. The Russian resolution, on the other hand, did not include the part on the no-fly zone and was in support of the UN Syria mediator Staffan de Mistura's suggestion of allowing the peaceful withdrawal of the rebels from Aleppo. And this resolution did not get enough votes. It was supported only by China, Egypt, and Venezuela, while Angola and Uruguay abstained. Obviously, these are the allies that the Russians can count on in the Security Council. The others are all in the United States orbit. The United States Deputy U.S. Ambassador to the UN, David Pressman, accused Russia of, quote, giving the license to kill and of being engaged not in politics, but in the slaughtering of civilians. These are the exact quotes. And he was supported in this by his British colleague. It is interesting that the US ambassador in the United Nations, Samantha Power, who is known for her sharp attacks on Russia, was absent from this meeting. This article also consulted two Russian professors, the experts on the Middle East, and it's very interesting to see what they are saying. The professors Vladimir Sotnikov and Alexander Tevdoy-Burmuli. According to Sotnikov, the probability of a direct US-Russian military conflict in Syria is not very high, because even though diplomatic efforts have stopped at this point of time, the communication between the two militaries continues. Also, Sotnikov does not believe that Obama would start such a conflict with unpredictable circumstances at the very end of his term. Obama would not want to end his presidency with another war, claims Sotnikov. In my opinion, Sotnikov is being far too optimistic and he is not considering what Lavrov has said. There are several factions within the Obama administration, one of which wants a war with Russia because Russia broke out of the role assigned to it by the globalist elite. They want this war as soon as possible so that Russia cannot build up its military defenses in the adequate way. Essentially, in my opinion, what Putin is doing now is buying time so that Russia could get ready for the violent showdown in case this aggressively anti-Russian faction prevails in Washington. And let me remind you that Hillary Clinton is the advocate of this faction. From his perspective, the other professor, Professor Alexander Tevdoi-Burmuli, states that due to the paralysis of the United Nations and the Western mass media propaganda campaign that blames Russia for everything that goes wrong in Syria, the United States War Party, this faction within the United States government, will set up an ad hoc military coalition of NATO members, for instance, and then this coalition will intervene in Syria without the permission of the United Nations Security Council. There is already even the narrative of war crimes, something that is very familiar to all who remember the justification for NATO bombing of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia.
We and our NATO allies have taken this action only after extensive and repeated efforts to obtain a peaceful solution to the crisis in Kosovo.
So all that is needed for this plan to kick into action is a fabricated large-scale massacre of civilians in Syria, which will be blamed on the other side, on the Syrian government and its allies, Russians and Iranians. So let us wait and see. And lastly, in this edition, it is interesting to note that the front pages of the Russian semi-tabloid press, Argumenti, I Fakti, and Komsomolskaya Pravda this week, focus generally on the economic and social issues and not on the international affairs. For instance, Argumenti, I Fakti, which is a weekly mass-market semi-tabloid, had a big report on the state of road infrastructure in Russia and how the government will invest a lot of money to improve it. The Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is a daily semi-tabloid newspaper, in the edition of October the 12th, on the front page, had an article about the possibility of bread getting cheaper because of the record harvest in Russia. The purpose of these kinds of stories at this time, in my opinion, is to show that the Russian ruling elites want to build up the confidence among the ordinary people that Russia is doing well economically and that any present and future threat from the West will be successfully overcome. I do not see as yet that the Russian tabloid press is preparing Russians for a more direct conflict with the West. And that is a good news this week. Thank you for your time. Be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor. Bye-bye.